everyone, guess what? It's almost the end of December. And yes, of course, it's Christmas time. But just in case you don't know what's also happening at the end of the year, it's Azure Advent Calendar time. I hope from now on afterwards it's going to be a big event every year. Special thanks to Gregor and Richard for organizing this online community event. We saw a lot of different topics, starting from protecting our identity to getting governance into place and working with policies, blueprints and Azure Service Health. We had a session from Thomas presenting the next big thing for Microsoft, and that's Azure Arc. There are many more Azure services that have been explained, which you can watch. If you think about deploying all those services to Azure, the first thing we have to think about is resiliency and high availability. We need to make sure that our services are resilient. Some things are done automatically in Azure, but we have to think of the responsibilities we have, and we need to demonstrate that we fulfill the SLAs. It's a common misconception that things that are put into the cloud are safe and we don't need to take backups or implement disaster recovery. It's not because Azure has 55 regions and one goes down that we still have 54 regions that are taken over, right? No, not really. When designing a setup in Azure, we have to think about resiliency and implement high availability, disaster recovery and backup. Fortunately, Azure has all those existing services that we can use when implementing IaaS and PaaS, but they are not enabled by default. So in the good old days, we had our data center and there were different compute nodes. So we had Hyper-V servers and we had some SAN switches below that were connected to them, and we had one big storage box with two processor units, so 1 and 2, and that we connected with redundant paths. So we had to think about redundancy in a way of we connect our two Hyper-V hosts to the SAN switches, but also to this one and this one, so we had redundant paths. And we do the same for the storage box, so we have two redundant paths to the different processing units. So I used to get into a data center in the old days and replace some servers or switches or hardware, and I still remember that when entering the data center room I just waited 5 seconds to turn on the light, so that was an instant Christmas feeling all the way. So those of you who did hardware maintenance know what I'm talking about. The good old sound of a server that's booting, it's like an airplane that's taking off. So if you have a second data center, then we could replicate the storage via storage replication, or we could use the Hyper-V or some other vendor replication that we can use to replicate the VMs from one data center to another data center. So it's good to know that here we maintain the hardware and then we replicate the state of the VM to the other data center with replication technologies. If we then look inside of the VM, we have an application like SQL Server or Active Directory. So we could use the replication technology of the application to replicate the data on a consistent way to another data center or another host. So it's still the best way to replicate the data and be sure that the data is consistent. So we have to use the replication technology of the application itself. But we come back to this later on. So if we leave the old things behind and we look at Azure, there we have a lot of different regions. So we can use 2 regions to implement disaster recovery in case of a region level outage, or we could deploy our services to different regions. So within a region you still need to design and implement multiple instances of your resources, so then you could use availability sets or availability zones. We have to provide high availability for hardware failures like a rack that's going down. So if we draw our regions, let's say for example we have Western Europe and Northern Europe, so this would be Western Europe and this would be Northern Europe. So 2 different regions. It's important to know that in Azure we only manage the OS layer. We don't manage the fancy storage boxes or the hardware like the switches and so on. We only concentrate at the OS layer. If we think about serverless, then we don't manage the OS layer at all, we just manage the application. So it's important to know if we deploy a VM, we deploy it to a region. So a region is a set of Azure data centers deployed within a latency-defined perimeter and is connected through a dedicated regional low latency network. So you create Azure resources in defined geographic regions like West Europe and North Europe. So in Azure there also exist paired regions. So for example, our West Europe region and our North Europe region, those are paired regions. So a paired region is data centers that are between 400 kilometers spread from each other with a low latency. So for example, geo-replicated storage accounts are always paired between two specific regions. So when updates are rolled out, they are very careful to not apply the same update at the same time to a paired region. So within a region we can have different availability zones. So for example, this is zone 1, zone 2 and zone 3. And availability zones are physically separate locations within an Azure region. So each availability zone is made up of one or more data centers equipped with independent power, cooling and networking. So within a subscription we can find availability zone 1, availability zone 2 and availability zone 3. So when you deploy resources in Azure, it's best to put them on different zones. So for example, we deploy a VM in zone 1, we deploy another VM in zone 2 and we deploy another VM in zone 3 and so on. So it's best to deploy them between different zones. So keep in mind that when you deploy resources to zones, the availability zones are logically tied to a subscription. So if you have multiple subscriptions, then the zone 1 in subscription 1 is not the same as zone 1 in subscription 2. They don't work across subscriptions. So another option we can choose in Azure are availability sets. So just a recap, we have our region. So for example, the West Europe region here. Within a region we have different availability zones, so the data centers, availability zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, and within a data center we have clusters. So clusters are racks or group of rack within with compute nodes in it and different cooling and power equipment. So if you think about availability sets, we have to make sure that our service is resilient between the different racks. So if you specify an availability set, when you provision the VM, then at that moment you specify the set. So currently there is no way to add a VM to an availability set after the VM is provisioned. So you have to make sure that when you create a VM, the VM is deployed between the different availability sets. So with availability sets, we can guarantee that our workloads are distributed over 3 fault domains. So a fault domain can be thought of a rack that has a top of rack router, switch, power supply. So if we deploy resources in an availability set, Azure will take care of the resources and deploy them distributed over the 3 fault domains. So this would be our availability set, and within the set or Azure deploys the VMs distributed over the 3 fault domains. We also know something called update domains. So if we have VMs that host the same application, then we can split those VMs between different fault domains, and we can put the VMs also in different update domains. So if we put them in update domains, then when the underlying hosts are going to be rebooted, Azure assures us that first update domain 0, then update domain 1, and so on is going to be rebooted and not at the same time. So in this way we can guarantee that one or the other instance is going to be up and running. So we recommend that 2 or more VMs are created within a availability set. to provide for a highly available application and to meet the 99.95% Azure SLA. So there is no cost for the availability set itself. You only pay for each VM instance that you create. When a single VM is using Azure Premium SSDs, then the Azure SLA applies for unplanned maintenance events. So if you have one VM, then you should deploy it with premium SSDs. So you have to choose which one you will use. So, or you use availability sets or you use availability zones. You cannot use them both for the same resources. To recap, if we deploy resources spread over availability sets and a rack fails, our service will still be up and running. But if the entire data center, so the zone, goes down, then we have a problem. Use availability zones if you want to protect your resources for data center or zone outages. In the case the whole region is gone by an earthquake, then we lost our resources also. So when using availability zones, you still need a load balancer to distribute the traffic coming to your services. So it is really important to think about the whole setup. So the last thing I want to talk about is backup. So make sure you have backup in one or the other form. Either use Azure Backup or use Azure Site Recovery. With Azure Site Recovery, the service is only replicating the changes, so you don't need to pay for the VM, only when the VM is starting up. So when the replication occurs, you only have to pay for the storage that is used, so that's very good. We can use a recovery plan to orchestrate the failover with pre- and post tasks. We have to think about the application inside the VM, of course. Can we replicate it? If we replicate it, can we start it up? So it's very good to test the whole disaster recovery process. Maybe we can't start the application, so maybe it's a better idea to provide a VM in another region and just make a golden image, and with that golden image we can recreate a VM as fast as possible and then just connect to the backend or to the database. Something good to know is that if you have public IPs in one region and you are doing a failover to another region, you can't migrate the public IP, so you lose the public IP and you also use your public endpoint. So that's very important to know. So the key takeaways here: think about recovery time objectives and think about recovery point objectives. See what you need and what your disaster recovery plan is all about. But also think about the costs. If you are going to replicate the application, make sure that the application runs. Otherwise, you have to provision a VM with some sort of golden image. So this is the end of the video. Thanks for watching. I hope that Richard and Gregor are organizing the event also next year, so maybe we see each other next year. So with that, thanks again for watching, and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Bye.